What I've asked the 6 now stooges planted among you to come up with is some kind of prompt or provocation. And they're 6 quite different prompts that I hope are going to take the conversation we're all going to have in 6 quite different sort of directions over the next hour. So I've asked them to prepare a question, prompt, provocation, and I'm going to go to them in turn. And they're going to throw that out as a question. And then I really want to open it up to everybody. Now, having said that, most of you will be really quiet to start with, and you won't say a thing. So I'm going to rely on the 6 people we've invited to respond to the first question to start with until you warm up. And then by the time we get to about question 4, we probably won't be able to shut any of you up, which is great. So my job is to kind of control that conversation a little bit. Okay, so Katrina is going to start.
I will throw you out a question. I'll just give it a little bit of background. I mean, when I first come into this space, the first thing I see is gesture. It kind of hits you, doesn't it? And I'm just kind of wondering a little bit about how these gestures have been made and the kind of techniques and things. And I'm wondering as well, what are the characteristics of the mark making? And I think the idea of mark making is obviously very familiar to a lot of painters. But what does that mean? You know, what does mark making mean? Does it mean gesture, or does it mean a lot more other things? So that's my question. Can somebody maybe say something about the characteristics of the mark making in these paintings?
Okay, who wants to respond? Stuart.
Well, I was looking at this vast painting, 20 feet long, something of that order, and I was thinking, is there an unbroken sweep on that surface? And there is certainly one striation that seems to traverse the whole goddamn lot of it, and it's pretty horizontal, and then I was watching the film and I noticed that in the central areas, which it would probably, there isn't a broom with a handle long enough, and I think if there was one, then you would lose that control. He actually walked on the panel when he made that mark. And I think when he made the central marks, he walked down the outside edges. And there was something about, you know, breaking a taboo, that on a stretched canvas, and I don't know how many of you have stretched canvases, you know, it takes quite a long time, and the point is that they're stretched. So if you tread on it, you sort of undermine it. But it was quite interesting to watch that. So, I've just particularly made that observation in that painting, that I think in those central areas there is at least a sweep that goes across the whole lot of it.
So that gives it a kind of temporal quality. So the idea that it's a time-based characteristic, if you like. You know, it has to be, doesn't there? Because you've got to kind of walk along, and that kind of translates into the way we apprehend it, because we have to kind of, our eyes have to travel across. And because it's so large as well. So you can't really take it all in one go, you kind of move with it, don't you?
That temporal idea, I think, is really interesting because it's got this linearity to it, but actually the surface, going back into the surface, clearly has a temporal dimension to it as well, with the buried tape. And there seems to be that there was some tape that was buried at the outset, because if you go up to the surface, you can see raw canvas, but there are other areas where you can see there's blue paint, so that must have been introduced later on. So I think there's a sense, I don't know if it's left to right or right to left, it's probably both in terms of temporal idea, but also into the surface. It's almost one of the sort of vocabularies of the painting, one of its preoccupations.
It's interesting what you said as well about this idea of the eye travelling across it, because of course with a painting of that scale, we physically travel across it too. I mean, in the same way when you're describing his working method of walking across it, we're not allowed to walk across it. Can't be quite that subversive in here yet, Debbie, maybe one day, but we can walk in front of it from one side to the other, and that sort of sense of travelling with him, you know, respectively with the marks.
There's also a kind of dry brush quality, isn't there, which I find quite fascinating. You know, that kind of, you know, it doesn't feel that liquid somehow.
Although the paint's liquid.
I'm sure you know, it's very liquid.
Initially.
Yeah, absolutely. It just has that kind of lovely, dry, powdery quality, which I think is really fascinating, and there's no not much glossiness, so it doesn't bounce light in that way.
Can I try? I'm interested in this idea of gesture, but it also seems to be an anti-gesture, a refusal of gesture, and that's manifest in the lines, which seem to, I'm not sure what's going on, but it seems that there's some kind of rope or string or kind of inserted material which is applied initially, overpainted, and then removed subsequently. And that's a subtraction, not an addition. So but I don't know if anybody's got a view on.
Does it give it a structure?
Yeah. It creates a surface variability which wouldn't be there if in some of the other works there's a kind of consistency of surface quality, and this there's a kind of ridged, echoing sense of linearity, but a kind of anti-gesture. This idea of it being a subtraction, a removal, and not an addition. And it doesn't do that in many other works, I don't think. Maybe we'll get round to talking about some of the other works, but this is it's a balance. To me, it seems to be a balance between addition and subtraction, and the tension created by that purposeful gesture, anti-gesture.
Well, that anti-gesture is kind of guided by the gesture, and whether or not in some ways there is an anti-gesture in the gesture that he's making, because it's not controlled as such, because it's by the brush. So this kind of, I don't know, where does this mark come from? This second mark, this removal. The mark making is coming from the idea of mark making in a way. So this process that he's going through is informing the idea of making more marks, because it seems to, in one way, follow the lines that are originally there, placed by the brush mark. Which is quite interesting as well, because we call it a broom, but I think of it in terms of a brush and not a broom.
I mean, this one seems quite planned, and as there's that one compared to perhaps that one, and kind of like a thinking ahead of, I'm going to have these colours that are going to go in this kind of order over other layers, because it seems to be quite, to me, seems quite meticulously mapped to a degree of kind of knowing what this might look like at the end, as opposed to that one that, I don't know if that's made later or earlier, where there's like a freeness of like letting the paint kind of have its own life on the canvas, whereas it's got quite an order to it. And that one, I was quite curious about the turquoisey one, where inside the semicircle at the top and the bottom, the consistency of the paint changes quite a bit. I don't know how that's been done, if it's been removed within that semicircle, or. But again, it's like quite kind of, I don't know if the artist kind of thought that, I want this painting to look like this at the end, and had it kind of measured and worked out to a degree.
Well, I mean, it's something, Stuart touched on that masking tape thing. We might talk a bit more about that, but before he's even put any paint on the surface, there are areas that he's decided to mask off. So there is a kind of, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you could imagine there's a randomness to it, but actually there isn't a randomness to this one at all. It has that. Well, one of the things I really like about it is the way it changes as you get closer to it. The sense of consistency that from a distance, when you come around the corner and see it, feels very, very controlled, and then you come up and the surface is grotty, and the dents where he's walked on it, and the bits of crap in the paint, and there's something rather lovely about that kind of inclusion.
But there's a revision or a plan in the blue. These blue lines have been masked, so there was either blue there first, or deliberately, or maybe it was a decision that was changed. You can see it's pulled off.
The ends of the oval are incomplete, so there's there's an oval.
Yeah, there's a revision over there, isn't there?
Yeah, but then at the end he decides not to reveal the full continuous sense of that.
That really reminds me. I was looking at this and thinking about all of them. The word that keeps coming to mind is they seem so complete in this way, even though there are these little areas that are incomplete. And when you just mentioned that the oval fades off, it's almost like a perspective, like looking out on the world, and then it kind of fades away quite naturally. So it's not really an abrupt cut off in any way. It feels like it should kind of fade, because that's what happens when you look at the world and you change your perspective.
I'm going to throw this out to the students. So we're actually talking about this, the blurred edge around the kind of oval. There's a reason that he does that. Did anyone sort of know why he actually does that? In terms of looking, in terms of your eye. So when you take something in perspective, you can't take it fully in with your eye, so your eye blurs the edges. So his work's a lot about looking and these subtle changes that happen when you visit places. So he travelled, he went to France, and kind of wanted to see how those spaces affected his work and how it changed, how his palettes changed, how the atmospheres in the work started to shift. So yeah, it's about optics, it's about the eye. A lot of us, obviously we're looking, there's a lot of looking, but yeah, the edge is to do with the actual, how much our eye can take in and how much it can't, and what naturally happens, what we filter out and what we filter in terms of focus.
I think I feel like I'm quite central to where I'm positioned in this canvas. If I just look in the middle, it does kind of almost fill my vision field, but at the same time, the oval, it feels like the oval kind of contains me. I can't explain it. I kind of feel like I'm held by this oval. If the oval wasn't there, I think I'd probably just gravitate out, and it would let me drift into the next place. But the fact that it's there, it's kind of like you are in this kind of structure and a part of that. If that makes any kind of sense. I don't know if you feel like that.
It sucks you in, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it's quite confrontational in that sense. It's quite kind of overbearing. It's the opposite of intimacy. It's kind of.
Yeah, it is a bit like that, like kind of your ear.
Well, when I first looked at it, I was thinking it has one direction, but there's so many directions, and there's so many directions that you can do nothing but stand in that one spot and be stuck to it, because it's pulling you to the side and it's pulling you in. It's almost like a system that goes in on itself,
isn't it? In a way, I feel like that it's
protective.
Yeah.
I wonder if we can, Stuart, can we go to your prompt? Because I think...
Yeah, I'd like to take us over to
this one. Yeah.
So it's quite handy in a way that we've been talking about that, because I always wanted to talk about these. And I noticed that, this is a horizontal one, but there are two vertical ones here. Although the building block of the paintings is quite similar. So unlike this sort of single directional gesture, there's this gesture that appears to have started on the outside and go into the centre. These have got sort of four gestures in a sense, whereas these seem to have another more centralised going in gesture. But again, looking at the archive of him working in the studio, and he was a painter that worked mainly horizontally. I mean, some of that would have been just the practicalities of the paint he used. He used a lot of quite wet paint. I mean, as he was working, obviously, this stuff was beginning to dry. I mean, you don't get that sort of registration of peaks and troughs of a gesture if it's not fairly dry. But in relation, when you're working on the floor, there's a democracy in terms of what is the bottom and what is the side of the painting. And I think we all know now in practice that you have a proposition, but then the action starts, And you know, often the most interesting things are the things that you don't plan, particularly when you've got such an invitation for things to take over in the process. You know, the way he's working wet into wet. Here, this invitation, this gradation of colour. So I'm just curious about when he may have decided this was a horizontal painting, or when this was a vertical painting, because that could be quite a relatively late decision. It could even be at one point it was going to be one orientation, and then later on it was decided it was another. Yeah, I'm just curious about that and what other people might think about that idea. I mean, it's not, I will shut up in a minute. It's not just about whether it's a sort of satisfying check and balance. I think if we took that and put it the other way up, you get a sort of a less sense of levity. And I think in all of these, there is a sense of compression in these paintings because of the direction of it and the sort of resolution of that gesture into the centre of the painting. And I am intrigued how that some areas, you know, there's a lot of paint there, but there are certain areas where it's literally, you know, just a very dry push across the canvas and you can still see it. And then there are these really interesting little trace element things. I'm not quite sure what happened there because there was clearly that directional push and then there were these other visual events took place.
Do you think, Stuart, that is, I mean, purely a formal decision at a certain point, that it is about looking at what he's done and then responding on a formal level and going, it works better looking at it that way?
Well, no, that's why I was talking about that it's not just about a satisfying organisation. I think it's about what sort of sensations you want to communicate, and one orientation will lead in this direction, another one. And of course the other issue is that part way through the process, this may have been reviewed on the wall and then worked again. But as we all know, you know, when you frame a watercolour, you tend to put a slightly wider part of the mount on the bottom edge because there's a sense when it's on the wall that something will visually slip out the bottom of a mount if you don't put that. So I think the way that when it's on the wall, it engages with our bodily experience of moving in and around space is quite changed from when it was obviously something that was on the floor that was worked in that way for quite practical reasons in some ways. It's another essay in another orientation.
Perhaps there's something more important at work in his in the organisation. Traditionally speaking, or through the construction of painting traditionally, let's say it like that, I'm trying to reiterate something that you kind of started off talking about, which was this notion of kind of top, bottom, left, right. You know, the painting has got some kind of organisational sense. It's constructed through its individual constituent parts that collectively makes up a whole, and that is always orientated at bottom and top, left and right. If I understand what you're asking or saying, is that by working on the floor, that's completely undershot, or it's over, or it becomes, it dissolves those concerns. So it's a kind of I kind of hate to bring up Greenberg, but it's Greenberg's notion of all over painting. This idea that there is no top, bottom, left. Everything is, there's a kind of non-hierarchy. It's a kind of, the painting is democratic, and the orientation of the painting is up for grabs. That's quite important. I mean, that's that incredibly kind of radical way of putting together a painting at the time that it was made. It's not so uncommon now. We could cite Pollock, for example, who's perhaps a forerunner in some sense to that idea of the logic of orientation. To me, something else is happening. It's something more like a painting like this. These, let's broadly call them tubular paintings. The tubular paintings are more like stacked sculptural attempts at making something sculptural. These kind of they're painted on the floor. We can only imagine what making a painting like this on the floor would be like. But they're painted on the floor, and these tubes kind of overlap and they stack, then space accumulates, and the depth of that space is incrementally built. And that's more like a kind of sculptural concern, a three-dimensional sculptural concern. When he puts it on the wall, something else happens, and the orientation shift produces something like an aerial view. I'm not sure whether aerial perspective was something he was interested in, but that's my reading of it. It's not a perspectival view through space that we orientate ourselves in, feet on the ground, head on the top. It's more like an aerial view, and so in that sense they're very vertiginous.
I don't get a sense of aerial.
I disagree as well.
Andrew, what were you going to say?
I don't get a Lanyon type over. I get a road somehow, but also just because of the perspectives that he's painting these kinds of landscapes. So I've already, my eyes and my body is already tuned into this landscapeness. So I see a landscapeness rather than a. Yeah,
you don't see a landscape there?
Yeah, but not this way.
Okay.
I see a landscape this way, obviously because of the landscape line. But I don't get over. I still get landscape with this, maybe because I'm tuned in by these. Lanyon was influenced by flying.
Yes.
Do we think there were any influences for the fact that he was in the he fought in the war?
Was he a pilot?
I'm not sure.
I agree with you. I don't see this as topographic. I think there's huge space going on. I mean, especially on that right hand side, the space beyond that sort of road stripe. It has almost atmospheric perspective going on. I feel like it's disappearing.
And the speed to it as well.
I get a cubist space where we're moving. We're not a fixed point. And that for all their vastness, someone like Howard Hodgkin comes to mind with these. They're sort of middle space for me. We're still in quite a palpable. You feel like you can put your hands in that space and sort of feel the objects. Whereas there's a sort of subliminal. This is all beyond us. Caspar David Friedrich quality to those others.
Yeah, stepping forward.
Do you not see a construction? That's what I see. I see kind of structures, and I see a kind of shelf, if you like, that something's holding these structures. And I think maybe if it was the other, I'm just wondering whether he thought, oh, that's working. This kind of weight. You said weight, something about weight. That's what I see.
My anticipation, if it was the other orientation.
If it was the other way round, then maybe you'd be missing that beautiful weight thing. But that one doesn't quite have the same thing.
Not quite.
So maybe it didn't work.
This horizontal one, I think, is particularly elaborate in its space. There are visual clues that, this is behind this because you can see that it goes over the top of it. Whereas analogous sort of forms of these mirrored forms seem to be behind that horizontal.
I think a lot of what you're saying and what you're drawing attention to is what I see to be as something that departs from abstract expressionism, which is probably what you were just touching on. I don't see them as abstract expressionist in that sense.
No, I agree.
I think there's something else.
Well, I think it's interesting that he was in Paris a lot, like Robert Motherwell, that I think he looked at a lot of European modernism, and that collision of the European and the American. I see them more like Motherwell, who seems the most French of the American painters. There are lots of little things in there which I think he...
And the jazz influence. Jazz influence as well.
Absolutely.
He was painting to music as well, so there's an element of that comes into it. But I think for students it's just interesting to hear different people's perspectives and how we look and take in art and how we see it and what it means to us and what we bring to it and what other things bring to the actual viewing and looking at the work. I think it's, it just shows how open it is.
Yeah, I mean, I paint figuratively and I can't help but see a landscape in this, really obviously. And I feel that if the orientation was the other way round, that's too obvious, it's too traditional.
Well, it would be if it was the other way round.
Yeah, because it's you've got all the density at the bottom, which is adding that weight, but then the colours are like, you know, morning or kind of sunrises or sunsets, and then you've got all that earthy stuff at the top. I think it would be too, I don't know, that's how I see it.
It could be read a bit more literally.
Yeah, that's how I'm kind of, I think, it, you know, if it was the other way around, it would be too direct, too straightforward. And I think, that congealed stuff at the bottom kind of adds, it reverses how we identify with those types of colours, you know. There's always like a freshness and lightness with light kind of colours, but this is kind of doing something else. It's turning into, I don't know, something that's a bit icky and reminiscent of, I don't know, body and things that are congealed, things that you would find kind of under the ground and dig up, rather than kind of up there.
I would think of someone like Hilda Klint. What happens to the way we read Ed Clarke's work? Does that symmetry or division, does that symbolism, it starts to take on something slightly different, because I see some sort of positive symbol of some sort with light coming through it. But again, you know, there's skies. Again, it's just the way we interpret it. We all have different interpretations. I'd really like a student's interpretation of one of the work. What work do you like? What one's your favourite?
We've got to hear from a student.
Do you think if this one was portrait rather than landscape, you would still read it as a landscape? Do you think you're being led by that orientation?
I don't think that's impossible. I don't think it helps develop that idea so immediately. But, you know, there are spaces around the edges, I think, of it, which are more profound, you know, physically profound spaces, which could give that.
Yeah.
For me, it's all like on the T still life on a windowsill. This, you know, is both an interior space and there are these sort of deeper spaces.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of depth in this one, isn't there? Quite a lot of behind going on, less so in that one.
Yeah, that does seem more, although it's interesting, that top left shape coming down is decidedly behind the pole, and the other three are now, so I think he's tying them in by that one because it's analogous to the other three, and yet it doesn't go over the top of that one.
Yeah.
I mean, these are bloody bright paintings, I think, you know. And you know, that's more prescribed for me, but these are really improvised. And yet I think he's articulating the space in a really interesting way.
But what do you think about that? Because there is that thing of the horizontal does immediately suggest landscape and the vertical suggests figure perhaps. Do you think it would be read as a landscape if you turned it vertically?
Not so much.
No.
I think I'm also interested about Thomas Apps describes her paintings, the vertical ones holding in the tension in the energy, and the landscape ones let that energy flow out. And I think you can feel that here a little bit if you compare these two.
That goes back in a way to what we were talking about. I think Raksh was saying about this, of the way that the oval keeps us in, because otherwise you'll sort of leak out the side of the painting. Yeah, that's really interesting.
I think he's really thought about that in these, and that might be something that's led him towards a decision about whether it goes vertically or horizontally.
I wondered whether they'd ever been shown flat.
What, horizontally?
Yeah, as they were made that way. I don't know. Might be kind of interesting. Andrew, could we go to your prompt? Because I think there's a link in what you wanted to talk about to do with certainly the way they're made.
So we're going to sweep over here quickly. I was just thinking about the gesture that he makes with the broom. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah,
So
what's
he's
going
gonna
on?
do this.
Disruption.
He's going to do this. Well, he might do it quite quickly. But if we think of it in terms of the space that it's being made in, as students, studios that we have, they're not, you can't do this sort of work in these types of studio spaces that universities are providing. But as a tutor, I'm always thinking about how we utilize space and how we can push spaces and how we can work with space. So the reason I raise this is for you as students to think about how you utilize space. What do you do with space? How can you make such a large work in the university that the space is 1 meter by 1 meter? What other ways can you get around that? How do you get around that? So yeah, this is all I wanted to do, provoke some thinking in terms of university spaces getting smaller and smaller. The world's getting larger and larger. There's more and more creatives. Yeah, how do you think about these spaces? What do we do with them? How do we utilize them? Is under the stairs at the university, is that a large enough space to make something? You know, I'm just starting to try to get you to spark thinking, basically, around space and how you can make full use of it. It doesn't even have to be the studio. You know, it can be shown outside, it can be shown in forests, all this sort of thing. We're particularly at a point in time where it's kind of pivotal, and we have this, with a load of restrictions, we have loads of freedom, loads of space, but how do we think about it? And I think I've just wanted to bring that into the conversation because that's part of my teaching.
Can I just chip into that a little bit? And I read about when these were made, he was living hand to mouth. He was like so poor, and you know, when we look at big works like this, think, oh well, he must have a massive studio and he must be like really rich and to be able to afford to make huge works like this. But he wasn't at the time, and you know, he was really broke, wasn't getting his work out there as much, and it's really like a sign of the times that were in the 70s, I guess even in the 90s, that you could squat places and have access to these derelict big spaces and make big work if you could, but it's not the case anymore. It's become more and more tighter, and like Andrew's saying, like you know, many of you might only have like a meter by a meter studio space. So you know, what's going to happen in like when you show your work in 20 years time and the work's not as big as this. I think many of us can't work as big as this because we simply don't have that room.
I guess, I mean, I think it would be really good to hear from some students on this. So let's make the question really
like,
direct and say,
who's made a large work?
Or who feels the work they make now responds directly to the space you're making it in? So, you know, how many of your decisions as artists are defined by the space you're in? I've got this much space, my painting will be this wide. I've got this much time, my painting will be this small. I mean, is that... Go on, say it.
Yeah, I mean, I can't work as big as I'd like, and my tutors encourage it, but because of the way that I have found best for me to work, it's that I work on lots of things at once. So even if I was to take my whole space for one painting, I wouldn't be able to work because it's not the way that for now is the way I'm working. But I was thinking, like, this painting is big, obviously, sorry, we all know that. And the brush, well, the broom strokes, they're very bold, and it's someone that is very short. And I think for a lot of us, we may in the future want to be going bigger, but I am feeling very much like I'm exploring lots of different options, and I don't really feel bold enough, I think. And back to someone mentioned about you spend a lot of time and money stretching and making a canvas. Like, I don't know, there's a lot of kind of other things. There's the money and there's the space, and they're all at play, and there's this idea of wanting to experiment and try new things. And I think with that, for me, comes lots of little experiments before maybe it'll be time to kind of go bigger because there's not space to go big on lots of things. I'm not sure if that answers.
No, I think that's really important, and I think what's interesting about that is it is all these other factors that might influence how we make work or why we make work. I read that Albers used to make paintings only of a certain width because that fitted in the back of his car.
Yes, I heard that
So he
too.
didn't want to make anything wider than that because then he couldn't transport it. And I've got a friend who only paints for just shy of 4 hours at a time, and that's his studio. And I said, why do you only spend 3 hours 57 minutes painting? He said, because I can park my car, it's not all about cars, but I can park my car on a meter for free for 4 hours, and I don't want to have to put money in the meter, so I paint for 3 hours 57 minutes, and then that gives me time to get back to the car and go home afterwards. So that's his routine. And there's something about context forcing behaviours which is interesting, but I'm interested in whether anybody feels you're actually restricted. You know, what Andrew was talking about the idea, you know, maybe you want to make a big work, but you go, oh, I can't make the big work because the space isn't big enough. How do you overcome that? And, you know, the other person that comes to mind would be Rose Wiley. You know, Rose Wiley's paintings are massive, but sometimes they're 4 canvases together, and if you see what she paints in, it's a cottage. She never sees those paintings as a painting until they go in the gallery because they're made in sections. So, I don't know.
I think that it is a good question to ask because I have an answer, but now I'm given my answer and I'm remembering all of these other things. Maybe bigger.
Exactly.
Can I just add something about being inventive as well? You know, we were talking about, I mean, during the pandemic, I was trying to get students to be really inventive about how to make work because they didn't have anywhere apart from maybe the bedroom. And it was actually notable that some students who had access to gardens, had one student in particular who made all these enormous works in the garden, hanging in the trees, you know, made out of junk, made out of whatever, sheets, bits and pieces, which they wouldn't have done if they were at college. So that was one thing. And then the other thing I thought about was this idea of using some sort of craft as well. That, I mean, there's a lot of women artists now and lots of women students. And one of mine at the moment, she's been making a patchwork piece, and it's pretty enormous, but it could be folded up and put in a bag. But I was just thinking about this, and then the other students are using string and, you know, kind of crocheting and knitting and all sorts of, and doing weird things with it. And they all become quite portable pieces. And I would say they were paintings, really, but they're just made in a different way. And that some of these craft ideas, I'm not saying it's necessarily always a good thing, but it is amazing how students can be inventive if they, you know, push themselves.
I think it's sort of challenging what paintings is as well, because then you get like paintings that can be folded or paintings that can be draped or you know, rolled, and you kind of think how many different ways can I make a painting? Can I, you know, paint a bit and then I know someone that paints in their loft and they on a big like roll and they just unroll it a bit and then paint that bit and then unroll it a bit and then roll the bit when it's dried, so they just do it in a strip.
And we've got computers, so we can kind of imagine, perhaps.
Yeah.
I mean,
like what
digitally
well,
piece
you
it
can
together to
kind
get
of
an idea
work
of
it
what it's
out,
going to look
yeah,
like.
and then do it. Yeah.
You raised your hand. You were going to.
It was similar to the point that you made. I was going to make a mention of this Japanese artist, Takasada Matsutani, who, when he was limited for space, he would buy a big roll of paper and just make his black drawings just to fit the size of his desk. And as he was completing it, he would roll it up. But when they're installed, they're like the length of a wall, and yet just a solution that's similar to what you said.
But I think as well, just to pick up where Andrew started, I think there's a, forgive me if this isn't what you're doing, Andrew, but I think it is. There is a sort of gauntlet being thrown down to say, you know, be a bit subversive. Yeah. You know, grab a space because nobody's using it and fill it with something until you get told off. But that's a good thing. It's a good thing, you know. Was it what you said earlier, we were talking, go and take over the lecture theatre when it's not being used because it's a big space. You can make something really big in there. You know, I think there is something about subversion involved in this. You know, how do you push against the boundaries of the physical boundaries of space, but also those other boundaries that are put on you? Because I think it is I was really pleased when Andrew said he wanted to raise this, because it's it's an important political comment at the moment. You know, we come out of 2 years or so of pandemic, and you know, as a number of people have said, spaces are being squeezed, and there are conversations in universities about, do students even need studios? You know, you coped in your bedrooms. Do you really need a studio? Just do everything on a laptop. Just email
but
it.
They do if they want to do large gestures like this.
Oh, I know they need studios. I want them to have huge studios.
I mean, we're coming up with all these inventive ideas. I don't know, fold up. But at the same time, somebody might want to do that.
Yeah, absolutely,
like
absolutely.
If there isn't, my point kind of is, if you can't see that space directly in front of you, you can traverse the university, and like a fox, you can find that space. That's what I'm saying.
I think that like the studios are obviously already divided amongst you all, but if you think of yourself as a collective, it belongs to all of you. So like collectively, you actually have access to an enormous space. There could even be ways to work out, you know, if you need to compromise and let someone use your space for a bit, you're building a relationship as well.
So when the system got implemented in our university, it was without our consultation, and so when we were being told of like this is how we had to use it, one of the things that we had a discussion with the tutor was, we've worked together for the past 6 months throughout a pandemic. Can you not let us use our studio space? Because the system doesn't particularly work. Some people work bigger, some people work smaller. So yours is what we really wanted to do. And is sort of, now that it seems to be less policed, is how we are working. Because as a group of people, we know who's working bigger, we know who has a show, we know who has this coming up. So we can, within the limits, do that. But it really wasn't encouraged by our university, which was strange to all of us, because we were told, you know, our fees are not for studio hire, our fees they're for the workshops. And the people that we're learning the most from are our peers, but then we're being encouraged to not work together with our peers to manage our studio space. So, sorry, I've just gone on a slight rant.
No, let it out.
But what you have said is luckily how we have begun to work together, but was not encouraged.
Yeah, I imagine that it wasn't encouraged, and I'm not a tutor at the
Sorry,
I'm encouraging it, which is bad because I'm not a tutor, and I'm
That's
surrounded
exactly
by tutors, and they might be like, no. But you know, I think that at the end of the day, your painting tutors, art tutors, they will want to be on your side, and you know, I think taking things into your own hands, as long as it's within health and safety, is fine. You know
Very nice, very nice
outside of health and safety. Forget health and safety. That's the bean counters to worry about. You should do
it's the
dangerous
managers
things.
that we need to talk to. Not the tutors, it's the managers.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to just echo the idea mentioned earlier about finding, like being savvy about finding other spaces. When I first started at uni, I painted really small, and then I decided to expand my work, and it expanded like way beyond the space I was allotted. But I feel like university gives a lot of opportunities, a lot of underused spaces, like especially around the waste area or like the AC units, where I spend most of my days now, because it's, you know, it's kind of a space almost half of this room all to myself because nobody goes there, and I can work unstretched on sizes that would have been impossible before, even if I was on good terms with my studio buddies. Yeah. So
that's great.
I think it's possible. You just got to like snoop around and find.
You might be interested to learn, I'm organising a symposium at Manchester School of Art called What is a Studio? Do we need one?
Oh, when's that, Ian?
Well, the date's not fixed.
Hang on, you're at one gig plugging another. You shouldn't be doing that.
Sorry, that was shameless self-promotion, sorry.
The guys can edit it out. They'll edit it.
You're all invited, by the way, but I haven't got a date yet. Maybe I'll communicate it through Hauser Wirth Education Programme.
So I've just been informed we have about 15 minutes to go, and we are 3 prompts through, which I would suggest means that the conversation is flowing in a nice, rich way. And I don't, at the risk of then ruining that by stopping where we are and throwing it out, I do want each of the Stooges to have an opportunity. So I'm going to go to Jess.
My question was going to be about whose work do you see having a good dialogue with in an exhibition? Where do you see the influence coming from and going on to? But there has been a lot of artists mentioned. I think like maybe some of the other questions.
Well, I think we should, because it will be a way of teasing out a few more student responses as well. So I don't think any of us should say, but if we just go around, and I'm going to do a really teachery thing. So I'm going to point at people who are not panellists, not stooges, and you've got to say who you'd pair Ed Clark with. So, no, I'm not going to go to somebody with a hand up. I'm going to do a really cruel thing and go to somebody who's not got their hand up to start with.
Someone
and we'll begin
Someone who's looking away.
Yeah, somebody who's looking away, maybe, or slinking around the corner. Yeah. Come on, an artist. Who would you pair Ed Clark with?
I like the comparison with Thomas Apps, but I see some of Albert Owen as well because of the swipes and the colours fading in, and Albert Owen has them in his paintings as well.
Fabulous. Look, you didn't want to answer, and that was a brilliant answer. Thomas Apps or Albert Owen? Let's go here.
I don't know. Maybe Ethel Adnan, just for the use of colour.
And actually, so you say Ethel Adnan? Yeah. So actually, of course, as well, if we're going back to what we were thinking about how you make big things, those wonderful leporellos that all fold up but expand, and there's all sorts of ways. As you had your hand up, go on. No, you can now.
I was going to say Robert Irwin because of the idea Andrew mentioned about like the seeing and the perception, and obviously he did a lot of stuff around us trying to see rooms in ways that we wouldn't notice because we block them out. So although not visually similar, although he did paint stripes for 2 years apparently.
Cool, thank you. Let's do two more and we'll go to...
I would say Hodgkin, like someone mentioned earlier, because of how gestural it is. But maybe also Twombly, just because they feel quite, even though they're so kind of expansive, they also feel really economical in a way. And the kind of, the mark making, the scratching, I think Twombly.
Right, fantastic. And one more, let's go.
I'd say probably Tony Cragg.
Oh, nice.
Just since, I don't know, I see a resemblance between the use of line and then like the use of the brush and the undulations of it. And I think these would work well, like paired with like a landscape if you were to present it in a different space. And I think Tony Cragg's works do a similar thing, so I think they'd work well together.
Lovely, thank you very much. Brilliant, so I think we'll move on to Ian's prompt.
Thank you, Henry. Well, I was listening to a discussion the other night between Simon Sharma and Tracy Chevalier, who you may know wrote Girl with the Pearl Earring. And Simon Sharma was advocating for Rembrandt, and Tracy Chevalier was advocating for Vermeer. And then this kind of question was asked towards the end of their conversation. You can watch this on YouTube. Which one of them is a painter's painter? I thought, wow, that's a really interesting question. And of course, you know the answer, right? Between Rembrandt and Vermeer. So you know the right answer, don't you?
No one wants to be.
Good, I'm glad.
No one wants to be incorrect.
Because they knew the right answer too, and I thought, and I was going to come here and talk here. I thought I'd ask this. I thought I'd ask that question also. In other words, is Ed Clark a painter's painter? Because I think there are many painters. To me, Ed Clark is like Hendrix. Hendrix was the guitarist's guitarist, and you have to try really hard to think of someone with that level of dexterity, musical knowledge, invention. I'm talking about Hendrix now. He really is a kind of manifestation of everything that's awesome in guitar land. And I thought maybe Ed Clark's that guy too. So I wanted to ask that question. Is he a painter's painter? In other words, are the things that Ed Clark foregrounds in his practice, the things that he thinks are fundamental. And when I say fundamental, I really mean narrow, kind of narrow, close concerns. Are they the things that painters should or ought to be dealing with and trying to come to terms with in your own work? Are they the things at the end of everything? Are they the things that we ought to be dealing with and thinking about? It seems to me that many mature painters arrive at the fundamental concerns of painting, the principles of painting. They seem to arrive there eventually in the end. And they're things that we've all been talking about tonight. Colour, organisation, shape, space, surface, scale, size, and so on and so on, all those things. And it's really hard for me to think about anybody else who deals with those things any more comprehensively than Ed Clark. So I just wonder if he's a painter's painter.
I think he's definitely a painter's painter, but I think your question is really good, but then it kind of made me giggle because I was thinking, like, as a painter, can you ever really look at a painting and not appreciate it for its painterly language and just get wrapped up in the romance of that? And I wonder if, like, you and I, people who are very focused on painting, will ever be able to look at a painting and that not be the first calling point to us.
But Jess, is that, I remember, so I studied film studies was one of my A-levels, and I remember going from the beginning of the course being very excited about the idea that I was going to be at school watching films. That was the main reason for opting for it. And by the end of the course, realising it had completely ruined cinema because I was unable to watch a film without getting excited about tracking shots and you know, how they were editing, and then to come out of the film with the person I've watched it with, they go, wasn't that amazing? I go, was it? I don't think I even watched it. I was so busy looking, and it took years to get past the technical thing. And I wonder when we talk about painters' paintings, whether as a painter you go in and you're so busy unpicking what's happening formally that you're not appreciating painting in the way that somebody who doesn't paint does.
I love doing that.
Well, I do love doing that too, but I just wonder.
That's so lovely. But I mean, I was just thinking, I was kind of with you in your first part of your question there. I was thinking, yeah, it's a really good question. And obviously, when you come in here, you think, yeah, this is all about paint and colour and all of those things. But then you kind of use the word should and ought, and I was thinking, yes, painters could be painting about painting, but they don't have to. You know, there can be other things that painting can do. And it doesn't, you said that thing about mature painters get to that point where only colour and form, often, you know, in that sort of slightly purist kind of way. And I was just thinking that actually maybe, but maybe not. You know, maybe painting can be about other issues. Maybe painting can be more directly political or have messages or other, you know, all sorts of other things. Whether it's good or not, that's another question. But I suppose I would just say it's not that narrow, perhaps. Maybe?
I tried to phrase it by saying should or ought as a kind of open question rather than a closed one. But of course, the great thing about painting, and the painting's greatness, is its capaciousness. It's endless kind of embracing of all sorts of different realms, and that's its ultimate kind of, you know, its joy is contained in its kind of capacity to embrace multivariable concerns.
Yeah, so it can be simultaneously political or narrative or emotional
but you
and
can only
formal
access those things through colour and through shape. Like they are at the bottom, even if you are making like a political painting or anything. There is just that, there's the structure of it.
Yeah, making a painting that's politically motivated doesn't absolve you from the responsibility of making sure the colour is good.
I'll break it down like this. Your initial interaction with that painting, that should strike you first. That's what the painting does. And then the layers start to unfold, so you start to unpick the political, the formalities, etc. But the initial striking, you look at it and you're kind of astounded, or you're drawn to it, and you don't think about anything else. That's the first kind of stage, and then all the other concerns start to come towards you. You start to think about where things are, how they sit, how paint is working, where paint rubs against each other, and also just in terms of just painter's painter. It's hard to define as a thing, because for me, a painter's painter is someone who shows me how to get away with stuff that I couldn't get away with in my painting. Like, oh, he only did that, but I would never have the confidence to do those sort of things. But it's different for each person, I think. So, yeah, what a painter's painter is quite an interesting.
That thing you're saying about the idea of that first impact is, are we going back to, in a way, what we touched on at the very first conversation, the conversation about the optical?
Yeah.
It's got to hit you optically. It doesn't hit you optically.
It's paint.
Yeah.
Paint's purpose, in terms of Greenberg, the formal notions of paint is just paint, nothing else. It's just about paint. That's what the formalism is. But sorry.
No, that's great. Right, we've got very little time left. So, Raksha, your prompt.
My prompt kind of moves away from the actual formal concerns of the painting and the way it's been made, and kind of thinks more about positionality and the time that Ed Clark was, the different decades that Ed Clark was making his work in. So it's more recent that we're seeing more of his work in the UK, and I guess it's the case in the States as well. He passed away in 2019 at the age of 93, yet for me, the first time I'd come across Ed Clark's work was in the exhibition Soul of a Nation, and it was like an oil painting, very similar to this, but more kind of pinky pastel colours. And I'm not an abstract painter, but I've kind of fell in love with that painting and was sucked into the way the paint kind of moved across that oval shape. And it's quite striking that it was oval. But Ed Clark was a person of colour. In many of his interviews, he talks about how him and other African-American artists, abstract artists at the time, weren't really kind of part of everything else that was happening, and they were seen as a second generation wave of abstract artists, yet they were of the same generation. He was born, I was in the 1920s, I guess. But my question is, so I'm going to read it out. Ed Clark didn't want his work to be seen through the lens of his race and his cultural background, or under the banner of black art. And in fact, a curator exhibited some of his work, I don't know exactly where it was, maybe in New York, under an exhibition called Black Art. And he was like, I haven't given permission for my work to be seen, to be read under that banner, under that light. And at the time, and I guess it's a similar case today, it's easier if you're a person of colour to get your work recognised if you're dealing with issues that relate to your culture and your heritage and your race. And that continues to kind of happen today. It's really difficult to detach from the person and kind of read their works. And it's the same for women as well. Like, is the work, is painting gendered? That's a whole another topic. But my question is, and perhaps there's no fast or straightforward answer to this, but what can we collectively do as a community of artists working in the art world, do consciously to support artists of colour to freely make their work without putting that racial framing on works that are made, because that framing in itself can hamper and hinder the freedom to just make whatever you want.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, and this, effectively you wonder if it's tokenism at the end of the day. And I mean, there isn't a short answer for it, because it is something that has to happen collectively, and you can't collectively change a group of people or like the entire world's perspective overnight. Sometimes I wonder like how much I can play into that myself and how much I can get away with, because I know that certain places are looking to fill certain like equality quotas, and like that's the truth of it, and like you do question how much do you get away with, and obviously that's not a nice thing to think, but when you are racialized, you're very aware of how race plays into everything, and gender as well. Like, you're very aware of like, oh, am I the only female in this space? If I am, okay, how do I navigate through that? Am I the only person of color in this space? How do I navigate through that? Etc., etc. So yeah, I don't know, I think it's an important question that needs to be asked, and I don't think it's the people of color who need to be asking that question.
But if people of colour don't ask it, no one else is going to ask it.
I know, and that's where we need to start like making the change. Like the question needs to be pushed from everyone else, because that's when the real difference starts to happen, I think.
The thing that always, I find it amazing actually, when these sorts of questions get raised, it gets really awkward and difficult. I see people's faces being upset. I see body languages and stuff like this always happening, and silence and stuff like this. I don't understand what the issue is, really. We're all artists. We all make work. We all make it in different ways. Ed Clark was hanging out with Picasso. He was hanging out with Giacomotti. He didn't have a problem. And the other thing he did, he went off from America, New Orleans, and went to Paris. And yeah, probably not very many people of colour, but he had a really good experience as a person of colour. So location, experience, person, group, etc., particularly in universities, it's like support systems, I think. If your cohort is with you and understands you, then they'll help you, and they understand the difficult situations and difficult moments that happen. Yeah. I shouldn't be the only person speaking about this, so anyone else got any sort of...
Yeah, I think, like when he went to Paris, I think they were more disgruntled that he was an American artist, and like, we're kind of like, what happens in, America, that's kind of, he was kind of sidelined in that way because he was from there, and Paris, I guess, maybe was at a turning point where it was the hub, and then post-war that shifted. So yeah, I think locality where you're based has everything to do with it, I think. And when you're I'm kind of talking as a person of colour from my own experience, when you're in an environment where there's more voices that you can share that with, things can happen. But I think you can be open about those kind of dialogues more.
Well, suppose that environment should be conducive, and sometimes it's not, and sometimes it's staff and sometimes it's students, and people need to really be aware of themselves. I think we've been made aware of ourselves over the past couple of years, 2-3 years. We've sort of realised a few things, so yeah, I think that should still carry through, because art school is one of the most political places, and the most activists come out of art schools in a way. So sometimes I see a sort of imbalance, but then I see something I feel really positive about, that there's like generations or there's ideas coming that people like want to move forwards, want to understand what's happening. But when you talk about the kind of marginalization, that still does happen, because Ed Clark's friend, so there were only 2 African Americans on the course. So his friend was at the same time as everyone else, and it's only just now he's starting to emerge because Ed Clark died, sort of thing. So those sorts of things need to be looked at as well, and who's responsible for those sorts of scenarios or situations that happen in terms of maybe silencing or, yeah, I don't know how to describe it. So.
But we do have some staggering blind spots, I think, in all of our institutions, and we need to be vigilant. And it needs to be openly discussed and questioned, and we need to keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and never let up, because there's always going to be marginalised constituencies. And
it's such a shame. There's all these so much talent out there, and these works, we're seeing them now, in the past like 3 or 4 years, but you know, I would have quite liked to have seen them 30 years ago, 40 years, you know, like
but
why are they not part of the canon as much as de Kooning? Or
I wanted to pick up on something you put in your prompt, which is around the idea that one of the reasons Clark talks about feeling he was overlooked was because he wasn't dealing with things that put him in a frame that people accepted. And I think there's a really interesting challenge in that, which is around what I think is a kind of white anxiety often about allowing the conversation to not be about the issues that sometimes are recognised as being very important, but then we trip ourselves up culturally by doing that, you know. And I think going back to what you were saying, Andrew, about we're all artists together. Well, that's the point, isn't it? So actually, you know, he's an extraordinary painter, and he's an extraordinary painter. That's the important thing that we actually should be talking about, which is great that we're finally talking about it. But it's terrible that we weren't talking about it all those times because it didn't fit a frame of reference that people felt comfortable talking about him in. And that we've got to challenge that. We've got to keep challenging that. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't address those issues of race and inequalities. All of those things need to be addressed too. But I think that idea of a community of artists is really powerful. You know, that it's talking about the work. And for him, you know, this work is about painting. So let's talk about that. You know.
And some of his work was political. I think there's a I'm not kind of expert on his work, but I think some of his work did respond to like race riots and violence in Chicago, I believe, and there's works made that look like it's like blood kind of being splattered across a canvas. So he was aware and he was kind of responding to that inequality and that violence taking place at the time, but I think it's so hard to shift out of the framing of people of colour. Sorry, Sev.
It's okay. I was going to add on to what you were saying. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Roxane Gay, but she wrote this, I can't remember which essay or what it was called, but she wrote this really incredible essay, and she wrote another one about privilege that is absolutely incredible, and I would tell everyone to read it because it's so fantastic. But at some point she wrote that people are afraid of nuance, and I think that's so true, and especially when you have artists of colour, they do get boxed into a specific category. They are only allowed to exist as an artist of colour. They aren't allowed to exist as, you know, an abstract artist. They can't do anything beside provide narrative for race, which I think is really upsetting because, you know, they aren't one-dimensional people. We are all multi-dimensional people, and in sort of trying to combat the fact that these artists don't get any light shown on them, and they have been ignored for whatever reasons, we still box them in. We still continue the narrative because we just make it so that, oh, these are artists of colour, and these are artists.
It's that you put your finger on it. It's the word in front of artist, isn't it? That is the problem. The idea that there's somehow a separate category, and that's, you know, it doesn't have to just be race, does it? Women artists, book of women artists. You ever see a book that says men artists? I mean, it's just so that defaultness is such a problem. Yeah.
And like, at what point does it stop being a gallery and start being like a museum, where we're like, oh, look at all of these like exotic things? I'm like, it's tiring. We don't want it anymore.
Sometimes that partition is quite subtle. In the film that Mark Godfrey and Zoe did, Zoe was saying how Ed's work is sometimes, this work particularly is seen in relation to landscape, as if he wasn't hardcore abstract. It wasn't autonomous abstract. He said, you never hear that about Rothko.
Right. Yeah.
So why is it you hear it about Ed Clark? And I think sometimes those debates aren't just to do with the overt thing. There's a subtle sort of subversion.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we'll stop there. But thank you very much, and lots of brilliant contributions. And I hope that it's been an interesting evening. I think it's been a very interesting evening. I think we could probably carry on talking for ages, but we will stop there. Thanks, Debbie.
No, thank you to you. Thank you to all of you. I think you all deserve a round of applause. Thank you, everybody.